Everybody. A very warm welcome to you. My name is Seb Crutch. I'm one of the psychologists here at UCL and the Rare Dementia Support, and it's my privilege to welcome many new faces and many familiar faces to another PCA support group meeting. So thank you so much for coming and joining us today. Just before we get started, I have a few housekeeping announcements. There is a photographer here with us today from Welcome. So these are for promotional photos for the website and so forth. If you have a particular keenness not to be in any of those photos, please just come and find any of us at the front, me or anyone else during lunchtime, and we'll make sure you're not in any of those photos. And we're also live streaming the meeting today so that people who can't physically make it along to join us can also see what's going on. But just to reassure you, the camera is pointed at the front at the speakers and the screens, so you'll be able to hear those not with us today will be able to hear the questions but not see your faces. The toilets, as I think a few of you will have found, are at the very back of the large space with a sign. But if you need any help, please do just come and grab one of us. And it's just a reminder that the fire safety and evacuation procedures, we're not expecting any tests, but should there be a need to evacuate the building, we'll be guiding you down, back down to the ground floor and then through to the UCL main quad, which is where we'll all gather. Yes, we're all part of UCL. Nicky Zimmerman, are you here? Nicky, if those of you who have neck flexibility, I wanted there's many people to thank for arranging today's meeting. Some of them sat here at the front, some of them still ferrying people up from downstairs. But I wanted to make particular mention of Nicky Zimmerman, who we're really delighted has joined Rare Dementia Support as a Rare Dementia Support advisor, and will be doing a lot of work spearheading our approach to welcoming in new members. Nicky's got many years of experience at the Alzheimer's Society and at St George's in running support groups, so an amazing member of the team to join us, and we're really delighted. So please do make yourself known to Nicky at lunchtime and get to know her. My final two quick announcements. One were to flag up the Rare Dementia Support Legal Advice Service, which has started last month. So this is a free legal advice service for members of the PCA support group and the PPA support group. So if you have any matters which you think you could benefit from legal advice from, there's a group of student lawyers supervised by qualified solicitors who've been trained in PCA and PPA, who will be very willing to meet you in person or by phone or by Skype to talk through some of your questions. Adam's here from the clinic. Adam, if you'd like to stand up for a moment, and Adam will be here at lunchtime. Please don't hesitate. He's got some forms, some inquiry forms, where you can just put a few simple details about the situation you're facing. Maybe it's trying to find support with benefits or how to describe your circumstances for legal, financial and other related matters. Please do come and speak to Adam or, again, any of the rest of the team, and we'd be only too pleased to point you in their direction. It's a really, really good pilot project, and we'd really like to see a lot of people make use of it over the next few months. And also I wanted to introduce Ken, who's going to briefly tell you about some work he's been doing with a Member of Parliament and might like your help with. Ken.
Hello, Ken Thomas, my wife Sue's got the condition. The close friend of ours is a Member of Parliament, and he's been on holiday with us and is well familiar with the problems we're facing. He'd like to raise something in the House of Parliament about this. For example, the dementia guidelines published by NICE last year, there's no mention of PCA, and a lot of the things that you should get for dementia just don't get addressed for a lot of us. So he'd like to raise something in the House of Parliament about it. But he says going into the chamber to speak about this on his own is going to be a very little impact because there'll be no one else there. You've all seen the House of Parliament when there's virtually no one attending a debate. So if anyone else has been in touch with their MP or is prepared to get in touch with their MP, could you feed back to Emma, and then we can collectively, George can rally with other members of Parliament who would have an interest to support on this condition, and we could maybe have some impact in that way. He's had success on other health conditions in the past, but it's a long, hard road. But let's see if we can get the ball rolling. Thank you. So feedback to Emma, please.
Great, thank you, Ken. Speaking of Emma, who's done a huge amount along with Emily to arrange today's meeting, I'm going to hand over to Emma now, who's going to guide us through the agenda for today, and particularly to chair us through the morning session, having a question and answer session about some recent research findings. So thank you, Emma.
Hi everyone. As Seb was saying, yeah, it's really good to see so many familiar faces and also some new faces today, so thank you for joining us. We are going to talk about research, but we're not only going to talk about the research we've been doing. We wanted to give you a kind of flavour of the different sorts of research that are going on into PCA, but not for it to be a kind of traditional academic style lecture. We would like it very much to be a conversation. We're aware this is a support group context, so each of the speakers will say a few minutes about some key papers or some key findings, and then we'd really like to, between each presentation, open up a conversation between the floor and the speakers. And it's my job to keep us to time. So with that in mind, I'll just, you know most of the panel, I'm sure most of you know Seb. Kia is a postdoc researcher at the Dementia Research Centre and has just been awarded an Alzheimer's Society Fellowship Award for 3 years. And Emily is another research associate at the Dementia Research Centre, and she'll tell us a little bit about some of her research later on. But to kick us off, Seb, I wondered if you might start by telling us a bit about an overview of PCA and the research that...
That'd be great. So I guess it makes sense at a PCA support group meeting just to say very briefly what PCA is. PCA is a degenerative condition, a syndrome, a cluster, a description of many challenges and changes in skills that people notice when there is some atrophy or shrinkage at the back of the brain. So PCA is the umbrella, and everyone here, I suspect, is living or helping to support someone who's living with this condition. And the most common symptoms or descriptions, things people go trying to find an explanation for, of course, are visual problems to do with brain sight, not eyesight. So difficulties seeing where things are or what things are, but not just vision. It's also things, anything really, the back of the brain is interested in anything to do with order and space and sequences. So things like calculation and spelling and writing, those are the sorts of skills which tend to change early on in people with PCA. And the one we're always aware, of the irony or inappropriateness of showing visual slides at a support group to help people with visual problems. So for those of you who can't see any of the slides very clearly, my sincere apologies. But essentially what's on at the screen at the moment is a triangle, with the top of the triangle being this general PCA, this broad description of these progressive changes in vision and related skills. Beneath that are two circles that call PCA pure, so people who meet all of the diagnostic criteria for PCA that were pulled together in this research paper by a group of clinicians from 25 centres around the world. And next to that PCA pure box is a PCA plus box. So that's people who have the symptoms of PCA, but who may also fulfill criteria for another progressive condition. So for example, some people may have disturbances in sleep, hallucinations and fluctuations in cognition that would be typically associated with another condition called dementia with Lewy bodies. And so the frustration and confusion, but the importance for clarity is that some people may have just PCA and some people may have PCA plus something else. And having that something else doesn't mean that we should forget about the PCA, because there may be lots of PCA aids and advice and strategies which are still helpful for you even if you have extra symptoms which others here don't have. And then the bottom of the triangle is a series of blue boxes which talk not at the syndrome level, but at the disease level, the causes of all these problems we've been talking about. And this is another point of understandable confusion, where people say, have I got PCA or have I got Alzheimer's disease? Well, the answer may be both, because Alzheimer's disease, just like dementia with Lewy bodies or Parkinson's disease, those are diseases. Those are the reasons, the causes of that shrinkage in the brain. The PCA is the consequence of that disease. And so for some of our research, we need to know what the actual cause is, not just what the symptoms are, but what the causes are. Because if, for example, we're doing a drug trial, we need to make sure that that drug is targeted only at people who have the condition, the disease for which that drug was designed. So that was really my very brief intro, but to throw it out for questions, because it seems like often people are very understandably confused about whether I have PCA or all these other labels that are thrown at you. So if you have any questions about that, now's a good, I think this is the sort of research that prompts them. Sorry, yes, so the bottom line talks about PCA caused by Alzheimer's disease, which is by far and away the most common cause, about 90%. Then there are some people who have PCA caused by Lewy body disease, which is probably the next most common, but probably only 5 or 10% or so. And then quite rarely, there are a couple of other conditions called CBD, which stands for corticobasal degeneration, which is another proteinopathy, another disease, which can very rarely cause, which can sometimes cause PCM where those overlap. And also very, very rarely, a series of diseases called prion diseases. The most common of which, sporadic CJD, is known as, it was known about through the mad cow crisis, but that's very, very rare. And then we've left an extra box on the end for other, because who knows, it may be that in working with people with this PCA syndrome that we find in the future other causes of this condition. But that's what those boxes are along the bottom of the triangle. Yes, another question over there.
Hello. How can we find out whether we've got the pure or the plus? And does it always follow that we will get those conditions that are in the blue boxes underneath?
So everybody who has PCA, it's being caused by something. But you may not be able to find out what that something is. The ways you currently find out what that something is are in certain centres, not in every centre. You may be given investigations that can give us a very good indication of what that something is. And that might be an investigation like a CSF, a cerebrospinal fluid, spinal tap, where a very fine needle is put in, we withdraw a bit of the spinal fluid, and we look at the proteins in that, and that can give us a good idea about which of these bottom circles you sit in. But lots of people will choose not to have that kind of investigation, or that won't be available to them. Other ways in which you can get an indication of what's causing, there are certain types of specialist brain scans that can give us some indication about what the proteins may be in the brain. This is perhaps a rather somber reflection, but a lot of people find out after their journey with PCA is over, when they have their brain has an autopsy. And then the neuropathologists actually look at the cells and how they've changed in the brain and can see these proteins and stain for them to know the final definitive answer. And the answer is everyone's got at least one of those causes. A lot of people, confusingly, will have a combination of these different things. It's not uncommon for people to autopsy, for the pathologist to say, well, your PCA clearly was caused at least in part by Alzheimer's disease, but there are also signs of DLB there as well, for example. So a mixture of diseases.
Any other questions? Any other questions on that? There's one just here. If you just wait for the mic, if that's okay.
Hi, I'm Christopher. I would like to know, please, Seb, whether, referring here to the bottom line and, the rich diet of 5 possibilities plus another, whether or not if there was no PCA involved, but there was classic Alzheimer's, then some of the choices on the bottom line, some of the 5 boxes you have there, would appear. Let's, for example, take Lewy bodies. Would that also appear in classic Alzheimer's without PCA?
Absolutely. Whatever presentation of whatever degenerative condition you have that's within the broad Alzheimer's sphere. So people typically think of Alzheimer's disease as presenting with memory problems, and for many people it does. But PCA is known to be the most common atypical form of Alzheimer's disease, if it's because of Alzheimer's disease. But there are also people who get Alzheimer's disease which hits their language centres first, or which hits the parts of their brain which are particularly involved in decision making. And whichever of those different clusters or of symptoms that you have, it may well be caused by a mixture of different underlying diseases. That is not specific to PCA. If you've got regular, what most people think of as typical Alzheimer's disease, i.e. progressive impairment of episodic memory for day-to-day events, the same thing applies in your brain. It may well be that you've got Alzheimer's disease, but also a few Lewy bodies as well.
Thank you.
Seb, did you have anything else you wanted to say on your... No? Okay, so we're going to now... Oh, one more question from Alan?
Do I press the button? No, it's okay. My wife had an amyloid scan. Are they still controversial to any extent? Is that absolutely definitive thing? That was instead of having the lumbar puncture.
Yeah, so an amyloid scan is one of the kind of special scans that I was mentioning, where by injecting a stain essentially into people and then using a special type of brain scanner, you can see the stain is designed to stick to amyloid, one of the key proteins that gets deposited abnormally in the brain in people with Alzheimer's disease. Yes, those are very useful tools that we've only had available in specific circumstances in the last few years, and which I think we'll see more use of. The controversial thing you refer to is the fact that some people can have a positive amyloid scan without actually developing any symptoms. So some of us have amyloid in our brains at higher than normal levels, but don't develop memory or vision or other symptoms. In a small number of cases, the reverse can also be true. But I think it's not a reason to be wary of amyloid scans, more just to know what we've always known, is that no one piece of information can tell us everything we want to know. We have to listen to the story of what's changing in people's lives. We have to look at the brain. We've got to use other investigations that we have to hand. It's all those things in combination, because of how complex the brain is as an organ and how differently these different diseases can affect it.
So I suppose the follow-on question is, does that then exclude, if it's a positive scan, which it was, does that then exclude any of the other overlaps as such?
No, those tests are specific for that you can find a positive result for a particular disease. It doesn't exclude the others.
And we will have, I'm just going to move us on now to the next topic, but we will have some more of a conversation about imaging a bit later on, and we will have Professor John Schott with us to answer any specific medical and clinical queries as well. So if we don't get time to cover everything in the group discussion, we'll make sure that you do get to have all your questions answered. So I'm just going to hand over to you, Keir, if that's okay, to tell us a bit about potential causes and risk factors for PCA. If I give you the clicker.
Thanks, Emma. So I'm going to talk about the 2 largest studies conducted on PCA to date. So Seb talked about 25 centres, so experts from 25 centres contributing to the consensus criteria that he just presented on PCA. And so I'd like to make clear that for these 2 studies, these would have only been possible through international working. And I think Seb takes a lot of credit for really also opening up that conversation at an international and multi-centre level. So the first of these studies I'm going to present relates to the largest study of risk factors for posterior cortical atrophy to date. So this involved over 300 people living with posterior cortical atrophy, donating blood samples at over 10 centres across the world. Now, this study is called the Genetic Risk Factors for the Posterior Cortical Atrophy variant of Alzheimer's disease. And while to date there's been no clear evidence for the genetic basis of posterior cortical atrophy, and other than a very small number of exceptions where someone has a mutation for a very rare form of dementia, often a form of dementia that's not typically associated with posterior cortical atrophy, but then develops symptoms of PCA, the overwhelming evidence suggests that PCA is effectively what's called a sporadic condition. So that means to say that it doesn't run in families, and rather people's development of PCA is likely a complex interaction between certain genetic influences as well as certain lifestyle and environmental factors. Now, what this study provided evidence of is certain overlaps and differences in the risk factors, as in the genetic risk factors, for posterior cortical atrophy relative to people with a more typical memory-led form of Alzheimer's disease. And while the study needs to be replicated, we hope that studies such as this will give us an idea about how, as Seb mentioned, some people with posterior cortical atrophy can have the same underlying proteins that are associated with developing Alzheimer's disease, but can differ so much in terms of the symptoms they're experiencing. And really by understanding what factors are influencing someone who has these proteins to develop more PCA-like symptoms or more memory-led Alzheimer's-like symptoms, can we then give any insights into these conditions that help us think about future therapeutic strategies? So the second study I was going to present, and apologies again for the unnecessarily busy slide, is just to get across a demonstration of the largest longitudinal study of PCA to date. And by longitudinal, I mean that we've followed up people living with posterior cortical atrophy, in some cases over the course of 6 years. And while we're still in the process of looking at some of these findings, and again, this involves scans and cognitive assessments that people have volunteered for, not just at centres like University College London, but also have taken part in the study via places like California in the States, or also in Seville in Spain. But we hope that some of the findings from studies like this can give us an idea about some of the stages of PCA, in terms of, in general terms, the ordering of certain cognitive symptoms, and what to expect when, but also to get an understanding of, again, based on people's MRI scans, which parts of the brain might be vulnerable to PCA and more memory Alzheimer's disease, or actually more resilient in either one of those syndromes. And yeah, I'm very happy to take any questions on these two papers.
Any questions for Keir?
I'm always making things, so I can do lots of things in Crystal Palace, so I'm quite happy. So I've done lots of paintings and everything like that, and so that for me is for me.
Okay, so we're going to come back to actually talk about daily activities and things to keep people interested and stimulated and things. But just while we're on these papers, does anyone have any queries about genetics or risk factors or other? There's a question over here, if we just wait for the mic to come from Hannah. Thank you.
Can you give us some further details about what the risk factors were, please?
So the risk factors for PCA?
The risk factors for PCA, yes.
Yeah. And by risk factors, just to clarify, you mean both genetic and perhaps other risk factors as well? So again, I'm just going to start by talking about perhaps the difference between a risk factor versus something that causes a condition, because I think people often get the two confused. So in Alzheimer's disease, for instance, the strongest risk factor is really aging. And while, again, there's a very small proportion of people living with Alzheimer's disease, so less than 1% of people with Alzheimer's disease in general who have what's called a heritable form of Alzheimer's disease, where it does run in families. Most people will have certain risk factors that are a combination both of genes and environmental ones. So the most well-known risk factor for Alzheimer's disease in general is called ApoE, and particularly people who carry a certain allele, the ApoE4 allele, seem to be at increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But again, the key word here is risk. So about a third of people who live with Alzheimer's disease don't carry one of these ApoE4 alleles. And on the flip side, a proportion of people who do carry these E4 alleles don't go on to develop Alzheimer's disease. So turning to PCA specifically here, what this study, genetic risk factors for the PCA variant of Alzheimer's disease, provided evidence of was that this ApoE4 status was still associated with posterior cortical atrophy, but if anything, to a slightly lesser extent for PCA relative to people with more typical memory-led Alzheimer's disease. But what the study also found in an exploratory analysis which needs to be replicated was that there were certain risk factors for PCA, but weren't seem at least to be associated with risk for developing more memory-led Alzheimer's disease. So these are genes which are implicated in things like the maturation of the visual system and also in communication processes between cells. But again, these studies are quite preliminary because I have to mention that while this to date represents the largest study that's ever been conducted on PCA, by genetic study standards, it's still a relatively small sample. So we're talking about 300 people. But again, people like Seb and myself and Jonathan Schott are still in regular communication with centres across the world to figure out how we can replicate these findings.
And just to say, John has just arrived. He's at the back there. So John, who we mentioned earlier, will be around to take questions through lunch and perhaps later on in this discussion as well. Thank you, Keir, very much for that. I wondered if you might now segue into talking a bit about different professional groups' understanding of PCA.
Great, thanks, Emma. So, in addition to the activities of the PCA working group, which really been instrumental with putting together the classification criteria that Seb mentioned, as well as conducting these larger scale studies, also within the United Kingdom, we've been continuing to raise awareness of PCA amongst different professional audiences over the last couple of years. So this will be something that's known to people who attended the PCA support group meeting last summer, where we had a joint conference with Vision UK, which really involves a network of people from more eye health backgrounds, so people like optometrists and ophthalmologists. So in the last year, we've put out a set of training materials called Which Test is Best with the College of Optometrists to really raise awareness about PCA, but also how to reliably assess visual function in people living with PCA. So I'm sure an experience that a lot of people might have had here is going to the opticians and some of the tests that people use perhaps not being quite so appropriate for someone who has visual symptoms owing to PCA. So an obvious example is with the acuity chart, where people might be actually pretty good at being able to perceive the individual items on the chart, but might get lost when you're presenting the whole chart at once, or might have difficulty moving from one line to the next. So as part of these training materials, we're trying to raise awareness amongst some of the eye health professionals about how they can adapt some of the standard tests. But other professionals that we've been reaching out to, so in addition to putting out articles in professional practice journals for organizations like Specsavers, or also magazines like Acuity, which reach out to optometrists, we've also been incorporating some of the research we've carried out on activities in PCA, and more specifically, ways to promote certain everyday activities amongst professionals such as rehabilitation workers. So these include putting out a course with the Royal College of Occupational Therapists called Understanding and Supporting People Living with Dementia-Related Visual Impairment. So this was released during Dementia Action Week last year. And some of our ongoing activities, which actually don't relate to our group specifically, but relate to people more on the neuro-ophthalmology side, include some published recommendations on people who might have PCA, but actually their visual acuity is actually within the normal range, that this shouldn't be grounds to rule out that person being registered as being partially sighted. So I think this represents quite an encouraging development as well for having, again, someone on the neuro-ophthalmology side making clear that actually people with PCA, that should be considered appropriate grounds for being registered as partially sighted, regardless of necessarily them having intact visual acuity.
Thank you, Kia. Does anyone have any questions about that or want to share their own experiences with different professional services? Yes, Doug?
Hello, my name is Douglas Banks. I've actually been through that process. I had a bit of a...
oh, sorry, is the mic working? Can everyone hear Doug? No. Is there?
How do I... Oh.
If you hold it a bit closer, it should...
Is that any better?
Yes.
Good, okay. I was saying I went through that process. It was about at this time 18 months ago when I went to the hospital in Cheltenham, complaining about the fact that I couldn't see very well and so on. And I met with the head ophthalmologist, and in about 2 minutes flat, she determined that my eyesight was perfectly fine. So I thought there was a bit of a disconnect between what the ophthalmologist knew and what people knew about PCA. So eventually I found a neurologist who knew about PCA, but also was working as an ophthalmic surgeon. That's the right word. So sorry, excuse my words. But so after a short time, I managed to meet this fella, a guy called Mr. Ferris in Cheltenham Royal, and he had several people that had the condition of PCA, and he agreed after a conversation. He agreed to say yes. Well, actually, we can determine that you are, partially sighted, and I eventually got a certificate of visual impairment.
Great.
So it is possible to get that. I'm surprised though it's not that it isn't available to everyone. You've actually got to go through that process.
Yeah.
To get that, it should be automatic, really.
Yeah, thank you. And it can be really tricky to find specialists, obviously, who know both of those fields.
Exactly.
So there are lots of nods, actually, as you were sharing that. So thanks, Doug.
Yeah, okay.
Can we just have another question from Chris, if that's okay, Ben? Oh, there's a mic just coming to you, Chris.
Purely for feedback purposes, the very helpful ophthalmological link conference last summer gave us some post-conference papers, one of which was for presentation to optometrists, ophthalmological people. So when Sheila went for an eye test on Chiswick High Road, as it happens, she was extremely well received and very well treated by an extremely experienced but quite young ophthalmologist, is that the right word, who read the paper with great interest and thanked PCA, the support mechanism behind it, for having produced the paper and was educated a bit into it. And it transpired that Sheila's vision is absolutely fine, but brain blindness, as we all know, is well established. I just wanted to give you that feedback. So it was a useful paper, and thanks very much for that conference.
That's really helpful, thank you. And also to then highlight the role that you all play as members in educating the professionals that you come into contact with, because often the materials are there, but to get them in front of someone who needs to see them can be quite a challenge. So thanks for all of your work that you do on that front. I'm going to move us along now to Seb. I wondered if you could talk us through how we investigate some of these unusual symptoms that lead to this sort of misdiagnosis and difficulty.
Yes. I think one of the ideas we had for talking about research findings is that sometimes with these meetings you may mention symptoms or experiences which we've not heard before or which haven't been investigated properly, and that sparks research. And similarly, sometimes those of us who are geeky enough to read science journals will see papers written by other research groups around the world which either explain something we didn't previously understand or which chime with experiences that we often hear shared at these meetings. So I just wanted to share a couple of those a couple of those papers. So this is from a group in America who looked at different cognitive skills. So not who said, yes, we know that vision is very impaired in PCA, but what about all of our other thinking abilities? Because we know that if we say to people PCA is just about vision, A, that would be wrong, and B, it would be unhelpful because you may all experience other changes in your thinking and cognitive skills which don't sort of fit with that simplistic description. So basically the blobs on the screen, the top left box is about attention and executive function, so decision-making skills. The top right box is about language skills. And the boxes at the bottom are about memory and about visual skills. And basically the bigger the black blob, the more difficulty people with PCA, they had 19 people with PCA in this study, the more difficulty those people had with those skills. So it's not a big surprise to see down in the bottom right-hand side that it was the visual skills which are causing most trouble. But what their study did highlight is one other blob in each of the other boxes, so particularly that working memory, that's the sort of flexible use of knowledge and information, can be troublesome. Let's just put everyone on the spot now. I'm going to repeat I'm going to say some numbers just in your out loud. If you just try and repeat them back to me. 8, 4, 9, 3, 1. It's great when you're doing it with friends. It's great, isn't it? Unfortunately, we're not allowed to bring friends into our cognitive assessments. But now this time, I'm going to say the numbers. This time, what I want you to do is try and repeat them to me backwards. Much harder. 7, 2, 3, 6, 9. Excellent. So you get the idea. So that last one, that's the kind of thing working memory gives you. It's the ability to take in information and rearrange it in some way or use it in some flexible way. And that's the sort of skill which is difficult for people with PCA, where those ordering parts of the brain are a little bit damaged, and everyone else. So I hope there was both a demonstration but also a bit of communal bonhomie there about sharing these skills. In the language box, the kind of difficulties that people often talk about at this group are retrieving words, finding the right word for things, sometimes needing to go around a word because they can't find it, and particularly to do that quickly. So the test they flagged up was either retrieving the names of things or being very fluent, being asked to say, as many different animals as you can in 60 seconds, and that being much, much harder for people with PCA. So it's to acknowledge this working memory change, this word finding change, and also to say that not all forms of memory are necessarily easy for people with PCA. On some of their tests in the bottom left-hand box of episodic memory, memory for events, people with PCA also had difficulty. And one of the reasons they think that may be the case is because many of us, when we try and remember something, we imagine it in our minds. And it's not just your vision for the world around you kind of perceived live, but also the way you might consult images stored in your head, be they memories or imaginations that you have. So I wanted to flag this study just to say it's not just vision. Vision may take the real hit early on, but there are lots of other skills too. So if you're struggling with other things, don't go worrying that you've got some other condition or that there's something wrong with you. This is an expected part of this condition. And the other study I wanted to highlight is from an Australian group, very specifically about visual imagery. And what they did, which I thought was quite nice and quite neat, was they asked a group of people with PCA and also some people with typical Alzheimer's disease and some people who didn't have either condition to imagine and describe certain scenes. So they just gave them a topic, like describe a beach or a museum in as much detail as you can. And what they looked at, they applied a scoring system to see how rich people's descriptions were. And people with PCA found it much more difficult to describe in a rich way what they were seeing in their mind's eye. And also when an external group of raters looked at their descriptions, they were quite sort of spatially disoriented. Lots of people without PCA would describe things in a sort of spatial order. What was near to what was distant, or from left to right across the scene, for example, whereas people with PCA's descriptions tended to jot around a bit more. And I think that just again is a a thing we have to acknowledge, that the visual problem in PCA doesn't just affect your ability to see what's immediately around you, but it affects your ability to remember things, to encode in new ways, new information, but also even things like, if all of us think about going into our kitchen with our eyes closed and imagining where the plates are. I can do that because I've got a spatially well-ordered image in my mind of my own kitchen, and I know roughly which door behind it has the plates, and I know what I've got to move around in order to get there. I can do that all in my mind without having to see it at all. And for people with PCA, that's much more difficult. And that's why some things that might be recommended for people who have eyesight problems may not help people with PCA. Because people who've just got a problem just with the eyes, with the visual information getting in, can still do all those inside your head kind of manipulations of space and sight. People with PCA find that much more difficult. So again, if you're having those sorts of experiences, or partners and friends are recommending things that should be helpful and actually are quite tough, it's because it's not just your explicit vision that's challenging. There are other things going on too.
Does any of that resonate with anyone here? Would anyone like to share their own experiences of that kind of thing? Or if you just wait for the mic, Graham. Thanks.
Hello. It's just a comment really about the visual impairment. We came across what I hadn't heard of before, a rare breed of social worker, a ROVI, Rehabilitation of Visual Impairment, who came to the house to see Anne and go through things like the kitchen and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And partly as a result of that, and it took 2 attempts with the specialist in the hospital, the eye specialist. She was registered as visually impaired and was given a card which confirmed visual impairment. It's just a comment really that that's a part of social services I never knew about before,
yeah.
and might be worthwhile other people following up.
That's really helpful, thank you. And I think at the conference that Christopher was mentioning last year, it was the first time many of the group had heard of ROVIs, and I think Keir may be going to speak with some ROVIs quite soon, so hopefully he can report back on that. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, yeah, just to say, I think for years we've been hearing about ROVIs, but I thought it was really encouraging at this, again, the June conference last year, that I met 2 at once. Yeah. So, you wait for one ROVI and then... But I'm going to speak at one of their quarterly meetings, I think it is in April, as in presenting specifically on PCA, not only on assessment, but also thinking of ways, again, of managing the environment, which I understand ROVIs provide advice and guidance on strategies, again, to support everyday activities.
Brilliant. What's that?
I think there's only one ROVI in Cumbria.
Yeah, then they're quite few and far between. So I've heard of mixed experiences. Oh, Claire has the comment.
Hello.
Yeah.
We had a ROVI came round to see Dave, never heard of PCA, and suggested him learning Braille, which was absolutely, totally useless.
Not going to help, yeah.
Seeing there were so few ROVIs, would it be possible to get them all together somehow?
Well, I think is that what you're going to...
So hopefully this meeting I'm presenting at, I think it's for like a ROVI organisation, so there should be a lot in one place. So
Good.
Again, exactly the kind of things I've been getting across is that, again, as Seb's mentioned, it's not a focal visual problem, and also vision. It's not just one thing. There's different aspects of vision. There's colour vision. There's vision for motion. There's peripheral and central vision. But something I'll get across is that actually a lot of the symptoms that people with PCA experience, they lack an explicit visual component. So things like, at least for some people, difficulties finding one arm or the other behind themselves while dressing, for instance, that's not the kind of thing I would presume routinely ROVIs experience. They'll be referred to people who have, again, a focal visual impairment, but not some of those disturbances in spatial awareness.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
Thank you. And it seems like there was a lot of agreement about your comment about dressing just then, Keir, and Keir will be running one of the small group discussions later. If those of you have something to say about that, Keir will be very happy to hear it. We'll take one question from you at the back, Richard, and then we'll move on to imaging.
Just a quick point, and I don't know how relevant it is, but since Lynn's got the wheelchair and the blue badge eventually, you go to a disabled bay and she has lots of trouble with the yellow lines. Mm-hmm. She knows there are yellow lines on the pavement, but she can't walk across them.
Right.
And you know, a lot of the disabled places where there are road markings actually tend to create, you know, she knows it's just a road marking, but she says it looks like a, you know, a trap, you know. It's again, the processing thing, you know.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you get around that, because obviously people are thinking they're doing a good thing. I think it was mentioned about the yellow tape on the edge, you know, the yellow and black tape on the edge of steps actually doesn't work with PCA.
Yeah.
It's really tricky, if you don't mind me responding there, because we actually, I don't know, for people who have seen some of the work we've actually done with UCL's engineering department, we work with accessibility engineers, and their head of their department actually said, oh, if people have difficulty judging the depth of things, use hazard tape. And then we had someone with PCA who came along, so for people who don't know, hazard tape is again the black and yellow stripes. For one of our participants, he said, if anything, it makes it more difficult to be sure of where that line is. Okay, number one, there is a lot of contrast, which can be good in some cases, but because of the addition of those diagonal stripes, it made it harder to be sure of exactly where the edge was. So we've carried out some systematic studies that do provide some evidence, exactly as you say, of people who are very sensitive to where you see some variations in some of the presentation of flooring. So where you might have a stark edge due to, say, a shadow, or where there's very gaudy patterns, for instance. And some of the conversations we're having are actually with people, for example, with Transport for London, to figure out, again, how they can be fed some of the research we've done to think, again, a bit more in a nuanced way about design for people who have that type of visual impairment.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So one of the things, again, in the discussion group that I'll be facilitating this afternoon, trying to get a better idea of some of these more, I consider them to be also coordination difficulties, and what are appropriate ways to support people. So again, even if vision is a really unreliable sense, that actually is it more important to make it, say, a more movement task. So I know some people with PCA who said if they're negotiating stairs, it's more about getting to the banister and almost not looking at what your feet are doing. You want to be sure about actually, for example, where your foot is in relation to the step. And some people will say tap each step successively with the back of their foot, for instance, or go down steps one at a time, for instance.
And if we can hold that question just to Keir's discussion group, I'm conscious that we've got a couple more things to get through, but that's great that there's such interest in that. So Seb told us a bit about the sorts of tasks you might do to investigate problems with thinking and cognition. Emily's going to talk us through now some of the ways we look at changes in the brain.
Thanks, Emma. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, just raise your hand. I know I'm quite softly spoken, so raise your hand if you can't hear me. So I'm going to take us through some imaging studies, or studies which use brain scans. So Seb very helpfully alluded to PET scanning before, and I know some of you will have been involved in research that involves scans. So this is really a scans 101, if you like, and just talking about the different kinds of scans and what they can tell researchers. So PCA, as Seb mentioned earlier, is just a medical term for back of the brain changes or shrinking. And luckily, we have the technology available to take photographs of the brain and show those photographs in different ways. So different types of brain scan can show different kinds of information. So I'm going to run through some of those different scans now. So one of the scans that you might see in newspapers and media reports is a black and white image, and these photographs are known as structural imaging brain scans. So this really shows us what the brain looks like. And thinking about PCA specifically, and looking at the back of the brain, you can see that there are darker areas at the back of the brain compared to, say, the middle and the whiter areas towards the front. And so this back of the brain, sort of black area, shows where there's lower volume of brain tissue compared to other areas. So researchers are very interested in what the brain looks like in PCA compared to people without a diagnosis of dementia, and actually different if those differences are shown across different kinds of dementias. And so, for example, in people with other types of rarer forms of dementia, this darker shadow might be seen more towards the front, and there will be more white areas at the back. And then the next kind of brain scan, where you can see blobs of colour, and these also appear in newspapers and media reports as well, is called a functional imaging brain scan. So what this is looking at is how much oxygen is in different parts of the brain. So just to show why that's important, I'm just going to wave my right hand. So this task involves a particular part of my body being engaged in this task, while the rest of my body stays relatively still. You can imagine that the blood in my right arm therefore needs a lot more oxygen in it to carry out that task, whereas the rest of the body, the oxygen in that blood might remain the same. And you can apply that same principle to brain imaging. And where there's more oxygen in the blood in the brain during a different task can show researchers what part of the brain might be involved in a particular process. So you can either have a functional brain scan where you ask somebody to do a particular task and then look to see if that induces changes where you see these blobs of orange and red colour on the brain scan in the photograph behind me. Or you can just ask people just to spend some time in the scanner, not doing anything in particular, but looking at which parts of the brain have more oxygen running towards them. And I'll come on to a little bit later about what that might mean when you ask somebody not to do anything in particular, but you still see these differences in where the oxygen rushes to in the brain. And as Seb mentioned before, and I know that Chris mentioned, there are other types of PET imaging. So this, as Seb said, effectively means that there's a stain that's introduced to the brain and it's picking up particular substances. And one of the substances that Chris mentioned was the amyloid, and also there is tau, is another substance that we're particularly interested in dementia research. And you can see from these different colours and patterns that this is the staining that shows there's a higher levels of those substances within the brain across different regions. And as you can see, those colour profiles look a little bit different when you're looking at amyloid compared to when you're looking at tau. So the research paper that we chose for the brain scan section was a group from California, so this is Fredericks and colleagues, and it was information published this year. And so they asked people with and without PCA to take part, and everybody did the same psychology tasks, some structural MRI, so that's that black and white photograph I mentioned before, interested in what the brain looks like, and functional MRI, so looking at how the brain acts and looking at where those differences in blood oxygen is within the brain to try and get together those blobs of colour in particular places. But importantly, they didn't ask people to do any particular task. So the types of questions that people looking at brain scans are often asking is, do parts of the brain look or behave differently in PCA? Do they behave differently in PCA compared to people without a dementia? Or do they even still act differently or look differently compared with people with different types of dementia? And so for this study, the answer was yes. So there were different blobs of colour activated in the areas shown on the photograph of the brain scans for people with PCA compared to people with typical Alzheimer's disease and compared to people with frontotemporal dementia, so where damage in brain tissue happens at the front and side of the brain as compared to the back. And this all differed for the blobs of colour that were seen in people without a form of dementia. Another thing that people looking at brain scans are interested in are, when you ask people to do psychology tasks, do areas of the brain light up that map onto what different tasks people are being asked to do? So outwardly, somebody with or without PCA could score the same on a psychology task, for example, so on being asked to read a sheet of paper. But actually, when you look at where the blood is rushing to in parts of the brain of people with PCA, it means that that part of the brain might be working a lot harder to produce the same results as somebody who doesn't have that type of dementia. And so what can brain studies tell us about the way that the brain changes? So we can do this, as in this case, this was just a one-off study, so people came for one visit and it was a snapshot of the brain at one period of time. But we can do what Keir mentioned, which is a longitudinal study, which is where we ask people over a number of years to come in and have brain scans once a year. And then we can look at the progressive changes, both in terms of what the brain looks like, so that black and white image for the structural images, and also for the function, so where the blood is rushing to. And it might be that where the blood rushes to in the brains of people with PCA can give us a clue about the way the brain is working really hard to try and either reconcile or compensate for the day-to-day difficulties. So does anybody have any questions? I must preface, I don't work day-to-day with images, so I will do my best to answer, but I might also check in with John Schott at the back to see if he has any better answers, but I'll do my best.
in that case, that's brilliant because we're running over time. But if you do think of any questions about the imaging studies, Emily and John will be around throughout lunchtime. I hope it's okay. We'll carry on for a few minutes if you can just hold your hungry tummies for lunch for a few minutes. Because Emily, so far we've been talking about research that helps us to understand what PCA is, but Emily is going to now briefly talk to us about research that tries to make some sort of change to the disease course or to the experience of living with it.
Thanks, Emma. So now we're moving on to trials. So this is something that tries to induce a change or improvement in somebody's day-to-day life living with PCA, or cognitive abilities and performances on cognitive tasks and psychology tests that we ask people to do. So I'm going to talk first about pharmacological, which is just a fancy name for medical drug trials, which I'm sure many of you have read up about and come across. And I'm going to focus here on different phases of clinical trials. So phase 1 is the very start of the trial after the drug has been introduced in animal research. It's the first time that it's been introduced to humans. So the main important factor is this a safe drug to give to human beings? And there are different types of phase 1. So there's phase 1A, which means that there's just a single dose delivered to the participants. And then phase 1B means that if that is safe and deemed as safe by the researchers, that those people will then receive multiple doses. So this just involves a very small amount of people, just a group of about 20 to 80 people. And if the drug is deemed to be safe to be given to human beings, then this will move to a phase 2 trial, which is a bigger study. Again, it's still relatively small. It's about couple of hundred people, which given the amount of people in the world might seem like a large research study, but in terms of what that might mean if we're going to take that drug to market and introduce it to everybody who might have these difficulties, we need to be absolutely sure. So then we move on to a phase 3 trial, which, as Keir mentioned before, is where there's lots of centres involved, lots of research institutions, and people all over the world are taking part in these studies, and this can be up to a couple of thousand people taking part. And the research study that we chose for this section was run and sponsored by a large pharmaceutical company called Biogen. And the parts of these, you get these very long titles with lots of words that don't really mean very much, so I'm going to break it down just to show you a little bit about what this particular study was looking at. So I talked a little bit just now about these phases. So this was a phase 3 trial, so that means that the drug was being tested in thousands of people. It's been deemed to be safe in human beings, and it's already seen some potential positive effects on cognition and trying to remove particular substances in the brain, so the amyloid, which I mentioned to in the PET scans earlier. It's multi-centre, so as I said, it's working with international institutions all over the globe. Randomised in a clinical trial and a pharmaceutical trial means that people don't have a choice in whether or not they receive the drug or whether or not they receive what looks like a drug, but in fact isn't a drug at all. It's just the act of taking a pill. So this is randomly assigned, and the chance is as much as flipping a coin. So there's real chance in this, in taking part in a clinical trial, of whether or not you would actually receive the drug. Double-blind is a procedure that means that neither the research participants nor the research doctors know who belongs to each member of the group. So this means that when the data is being analysed, the researchers can't be biased in trying to show a positive effect for the drug because they genuinely don't know who's received the treatment and who's received the placebo. And I've mentioned placebo, but I'm very happy to take questions if that term's unclear. And then parallel study just means that one group is receiving one drug and the other group is receiving the placebo, but that's happening at the same time. You can get other forms of clinical trials whereby people receive first one intervention and then later on receive another. And this Biogen study clinical trial was looking at a substance called aducanumab. So it's just a fancy name for a particular drug that's trying to tag on to amyloid substances in the brain that we know to be important in cognitive decline and try and remove those substances and break them down. So at the moment, the phase 3 study that's just behind me is a title of a study that's currently, it's just finished recruiting, but there have been some reports from the phase 1B study, so a safety study of this same drug, and those reports came out in October with some potentially positive effects, but very exploratory at this stage, but potentially positive, looking effects of different effects on psychology tasks and the amount of amyloid that was left over in the brains of these people after taking these drugs. So early days, but just to say that these drug trials are ongoing. And I think it's... Yes, Chris? That I'm not actually au fait with, but I think John might be able to answer, or if any of the panel members are aware.
I can't give you an exact number, but it was quite high. At least, and also I think it depended on the centre, so I think when we were involved in it, it was also quite a high threshold.
Chris, just to be clear, are you talking about the criteria to be included in the trial? Yes, and I think that's an important point to raise, that taking part in a clinical trial involving a drug is it's time intensive, it involves an incredible amount of commitment, and the inclusion criteria, so the list that we run through and that we require of people to take part in these trials, can be quite stringent, and they have a very high demand of people. So we need to make absolutely sure, as Seb mentioned right at the beginning, that we're targeting the people that we think might be a benefit from this kind of drug immediately. Chris?
Thank you. Sorry to bang on about this, but
No,
could you,
not at all.
since we're discussing things in a generic fashion here, and you just produced one example, that's why I raised the threshold question, which unfortunately we were unable to reach. But in the more general sense, in medical trials, what is the protocol for informing those who have taken part in a trial, whether successful or not? I mean, whether the drug proceeds to another one or not. What is the protocol generally accepted in your profession for feedback to be given to those who have taken part, and in what time scale?
Again, a very good question. I'm afraid I'm going to have to defer to John, if that's all right, for answering that one. He's just at the back, just taking questions. Thanks, John.
So it depends on the phase of the drug studies, but almost all drug studies will be, as has been described here, so double blind, so that the researcher that you see won't know whether you're getting a placebo or the real medication, and neither will you as an individual. Very occasionally, that blinding process needs to be broken down if there's a problem with the trial, but usually not. The results then will be made available to the researchers and to the research community, but only on a group level. So they will be made available as in the grouped results between those who have been on the real medication versus those who've been on the placebo. And usually it is not made clear to an individual which medication they have been on. Occasionally, clinical trials will or have in the past proceeded on a basis of what's called compassionate use. So in other words, giving medication once the trial has completed, either to people who've been on the medication or to all participants. But that's usually not part of the clinical trial protocol. So the answer is, generally speaking, individuals who take part in a trial will not know whether or not they have been on the active treatment or not. And in fact, the researchers who they will be having contact with on a daily basis will not know either.
Thank you, John.
But at the end of the trial,
if I can, sorry, in the interest of time, if we can carry on these conversations at lunch, that would be great. But do approach John. He's hanging around for lunchtime as well. Emily, I wondered if, just in the interest of time as well, I don't want to rush you, but if you could also tell us about non-pharmacological trials briefly, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. So as I mentioned, drug trials, there are also non-pharmacological or non-pharma trials, and what these involve is that we're trying to induce a change, but not by delivering a medical drug. So we're trying to look at other ways and behavioural ways that we can induce a change and improvement in day-to-day life in people with PCA. So non-pharmacological, no medical drug, intervention, trying to make a change. And so this particular research study from a group in France looked at all the literature available for these types of trials, and they came up with two umbrella approaches to delivering these interventions. So one intervention is a cognitive rehabilitation program. So this might be, as Graham mentioned at the back, about ROVIs and some of the approaches that they take. So this is working with people with PCA's individual needs, which, as we know, can be very different to people with typical Alzheimer's and people with memory problems, and to set goals. And so ROVIs or others can use suitable assessments to see whether these goals are met. And the idea and the aim behind this is to train people in ways to either compensate or in some cases restore the aspects of day-to-day living that people with PCA have found difficult. So this can be done individually or in a group as well. And then the second umbrella approach that these researchers in France found that can be useful are psychoeducational programs. Now you might be thinking, what on earth is psychoeducational compared to just an educational program? So education, it's all about the intended audience. So educational programs are delivered with the intention to teach, but teach people like students and professionals who may take that later into their practice. Psychoeducational programs work on a sort of knowledge is power premise. So this is the intended audience is actually for people with PCA and their families and people supporting them. And the idea is that the more you know about your disease, the more that you might be able to cope with the difficulties and understand that when you find things difficult, why that might be. And so not thinking that there might be something else wrong, but through further education of that disease, increasing the knowledge may help with the overall coping. So I'm aware of time, so I don't want to go on, but there were other points. I'm very happy to take questions on this during the lunch hour.
Thank you, Emily. And if you want to just let us know about your current research study that you're running, that would be great. And then I'll explain the plan for after lunch as well.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for your patience just while I run through this. So this is part of my PhD study, and a number of you in the audience have already taken part, so thank you very much. And if you could plug how great it is at lunch, that would be great. So for my PhD, I'm looking at how people physically respond when they listen to or participate in music activities. So I'm currently inviting people with PCA between now and the end of July to take part in this study. It's taking part at the Dementia Research Centre, so just down the road in Queen's Square. And the research visit takes up to 4 hours, which might sound like quite a lot. It includes a long lunch break, so an hour, and I always allow about 2 hours for psychology, but this can take between 1 to 2 hours, so it can be between 3 and 4 hours, but shorter even still if you want a shorter break. And what that visit involves is I would be asking you to answer some questions about, background questions about your health and interest in music and what you like to listen to, things like that. Then I'd be fitting 2 wristbands, one on each wrist, that measure things like your heart rate and the temperature on the surface of your skin. And then I'd be asking you to listen to some music clips as a camera on a desk tracks your eyes. And then we'd break for lunch, and then afterwards the afternoon would be some psychology tasks. So if you're interested, please do see me at lunch, or if you have any questions about the study. For anybody interested who can't be with us today but who's watching on the live stream or watching the follow-up video, please email me on e.brotherhood@ucl.ac.uk. And just another thanks to everybody here today who's already taken part. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so lots of information. Thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you all for your questions and comments. There's probably lots of questions still outstanding, but I'm aware of the time. We'll break for lunch now, but just to let you know that after lunch, Seb will run a general PCA Q&A group. So if you have any questions left over from this session, that will be down here in the main area after lunch. So come back here. John's around for clinical trials type questions. Emily's around as well for her research questions during lunch. And then after lunch, there'll be that group down here at the front. Emily and I will be running some workshops at the back there, and these will all be signposted on the tables, about research outcomes for the new Rare Dementia Support Impact Study that we're just about to start, the 5-year project. So before we start measuring what these groups should be doing and what people want to get from them, we really want to have a conversation with you all and just see what are your priorities for these sorts of meetings, what do you need most at what time. So that would be really contributing to a discussion about research. Whereas Nicky Zimmerman, who you've all been introduced to, will be running another group over this side about more practical care and support needs, maybe in your local area. If you need more sort of practical help with support services, she will be happy to talk to you about that. And as we mentioned, Keir will be running a group about sort of reaching and coordination difficulties and his research project that will be aiming to look at that and would really value your input. But we'll run about and remind you all what's happening where. And in the meantime, thank you for your attention and enjoy your sandwiches. And we'll see you at 1 o'clock.